Good evening, everyone. This is Rob Orson with Emerging Revolutionary War, back with you tonight on our the fifth night of recapping Ken Burns' series on the American Revolution. A lot of stuff would happen in this episode, and we're going to get to it, but I want to introduce some new people with us tonight. We have Dan Davis, who is a contributor to ERW, and he's working on a Bunker Hill book right now for the book series. And we also have Mark Malloy, who's here pretty much every night. I guess Mark has nothing else better to do, but we love to have him because he always adds a little bit of humor. And I promise someone from across the pond, and Darren Rawlings is here. Darren, tell everyone all the different things you're doing over in the UK. Introduce yourself a little bit.
Hello there. Yeah, thanks for having me on for a start. So I've been watching you guys at my tea break for the last four nights and I've only managed to see 20 minutes of each because, my boss is a bit stingy with time. Doesn't like us having too long. No, I'm only joking. But yeah, no. I'm a podcaster. I also help out Emergency Wars social media side of things. Yeah, I gave Rob a good tour of London and nearly
Yeah.
chucked him in the Tower of London. Sorry, I said I weren't going to mention
That's
that.
right. That's right. We did a couple of videos over there, and we're happy to have Darren involved. And it's 3 a.m. over there, so that is dedication that you
Certainly is.
usually do not get from Emerging Revolutionary War. But I appreciate
I
that.
don't know. I think your tour of Boston was dedication, to be honest with you.
That
Guys.
was dedication.
Yeah.
All right, so Darren, thanks for being here. And when we start talking about this, I may have you just kind of give an overall synopsis of what you think about the whole series, but we'll wait on that. We knew they had a lot to pack in 2 nights, and tonight they did pack a lot in. They focused on some things I didn't expect them to focus on, but we'll get to that. But we've been starting this whole thing by going around the horn as far as what everyone kind of thought of this episode. So, Mark, I'm going to have you start us off and just kind of give us a quick overview of what you thought tonight.
Yeah, no. And having written a book about Charleston during the Revolution, I was glad to see finally we're going to the Southern campaign at last, and really giving some attention to that, which they did during the latter part of tonight's episode. Uh, Overall, this episode, it's covering a lot, everything from Valley Forge all the way up to the Siege of Charleston, and everything in between. A good portion of tonight's episode was really focused on the Western theater, which I think we mentioned last night with Eric Sterner here, really hadn't gotten that much attention yet. So I was glad to see that brought out a little bit more. Although I do have some opinions about how they couched that whole campaign. But overall, I thought this was a good episode. I don't think it's as strong as the past two ones, that we watched. But I still thought it was a pretty solid episode. And again, going back to who the audience is, I think there's really something for all sorts of different audiences across the country because you're really hitting. And I also did like the inclusion of John Paul Jones and the privateers and everything going on the water as well. We have Spain make its entrance. So there was a lot going on in this episode, which at times seemed a little disjointed just because it's like all of a sudden we're in Charleston and there's this guy Benjamin Lincoln and he's in charge, and none of that had been like kind of built up and introduced. So, but there's only so much you can do with the amount of
Right. That's kind of a
things
theme.
you're trying to
Right.
cover. But, yeah. But
Dan.
yeah, overall solid, but yeah,
All right,
I'll
Mark, you
pass it
talked
on
enough.
to.
You talked enough, Mark. Dan, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Mark. They're not moving at breakneck speed, but they're certainly putting in covering a lot of ground. I mean, you talk about, December of 77 all the way up to May of 1780. There's a lot that's going in there, a lot that's being folded into that episode. Really enjoyed seeing some of the Western stuff as well, especially with Sullivan's expedition. So, a little bit surprised to see the emphasis upon John Paul Jones. Really enjoyed seeing that. I really do hope now with the introduction, as Mark mentioned, to Spain, I would really like to see tomorrow night then finish it off and talk about Galvez's campaign along the Gulf Coast and the capture of Mobile, the siege and capture of Pensacola, which is a really just it's a backwater story of the American Revolution, especially in that part of the country. Most folks don't associate the Gulf Coast with the American Revolution at all, but I think it's serving overall. The series has been watching every night. It's been serving its purpose. I think, and I hope it's going to serve as a vehicle in for folks who may not be very familiar with the American Revolution, haven't been exposed to it. I hope this is sort of the vehicle in for the 250th.
Yeah, I think that's the hope, and for preservation, obviously, as well. Mr. Rawlings,
Yes. So
King George the Eighth.
yes. So I would like to share their sentiments. I've really enjoyed. I mean, I've been binge watched it since Wednesday morning. Actually, I literally finished. I think it was about 11 o'clock. I finished the fourth episode, and when it mentioned the French coming in, and I was really excited for this next episode for the French to come in. You didn't really see much about the French, but overall, it's such a great series. Straight away, it's got a very similar feel to the Civil War, I felt, with the way it's put across and the way it's explained, and the way they use the quotes. I quite like the narrator as well. Yeah, it's very good.
So let's dive into some of the things you guys brought up that I think is worth kind of focusing in on. Getting a lot of comments. I'm reading comments here. I'm looking down at my phone. I was surprised too. No Molly Pitcher mentioned at Monmouth, which they've been really good about highlighting women's roles in the American Revolution, and it's one of the ones most people know some sort of way, but not mentioned at all, which I thought was kind of unusual. What do you all think about that?
Yeah, I was live texting with one of our mutual friends and mutual colleagues, and that actually came up during our live text, as well as the fact that they did not, shout out to Kate, they did not finish off the story of Charles Lee at Monmouth
Oh,
either.
true.
Lee was forgotten.
That's right. Huh, that's a good one. And that's another famous story, which I know a lot of people who know that story, or know Monmouth probably appreciate them not talking about that story because the leaves would be shaking on the trees, right? But but it is an important story that wasn't meant that wasn't really mentioned. Um,
Yeah, wait, before we get off Monmouth, just you mentioned Molly Pitcher. First of all, that was surprising, especially because they had a shot of a woman pouring water on a soldier,
right.
right? Talking about it. So, and they have been using a lot of Joseph Plum Martin quotes, and Martin has a great recollection of Molly Pitcher in his memoir. So that and especially because earlier in the series they did bring in Margaret Corbin, and so you think
Yep.
Molly Pitcher is one of those heroines that's been remembered, and yeah, that was surprising. So I was surprised by that. But and you're right. The other thing was the whole Charles Lee story, which for a lot of the audience in this day and age too, they are familiar with Charles Lee from the Hamilton musical, where they talk about Charles Lee crapping the bed at Monmouth.
Are you gonna sing for us, Mark?
No, I'll save you. I also did the PG version of the lyrics there too. But
Yeah.
anyways, but Charles the Charles Lee and Washington story, which is a common story in the American Revolution and the war, and Monmouth is like the climax of that story. You're right. That was like pretty much cut out of the entire. I mean, they talk about Lee leading the troops, and it was like building up to this confrontation, and then the confrontation doesn't really happen. They just focus on Washington rallying the troops and then the end of the battle. And so I found that really surprising because they also usually use that story to talk about Washington and all these other people that are trying to vie for his position. And you really don't get that sense either that Washington was on, the Conway cabal. I mean, you really don't get this whole story of this attempt to dethrone Washington and all, Hamilton and Lawrence and everybody else trying to defend him. All of that wasn't in this, which it was surprising, from my opinion.
Yeah, there was no mention of the Conway Cabal in the Valley Forge
Mhm.
segment.
I was going to bring up Valley Forge next because it did focus a good bit on Valley Forge. Nathaniel Green, obviously, and obviously the importance of von Steuben. Um, and not to get controversial, but they did touch a little bit, Mark, on the von Steuben story there. Some of the, some of the controversy that followed him here to the States. What'd you think about that? It was interesting to hear them bring that up, and not really just bring it up and just drop it, which was kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, that was surprising because yeah, von Steuben and also von Steuben they bring up, and I do like that they focus on the story. The story I love about von Steuben is and they do include it in the series, is you tell a Prussian soldier to do something and he does it, but for an American soldier you have to explain why you're doing something and then they do it. And really significance of him in revitalizing the American army out there. But you're right, he comes over to America in this like cloud of mystery or whatever, and in the series they just say, oh, he was for taking liberties with young boys. And then you're right, they don't
Drop it.
extrapolate into that whatsoever, which I
Right.
thought was interesting.
Right. But yeah, definitely showed the importance of what he meant to getting the army organized. And obviously, if you go to Valley Forge, which is what we always try to promote, people going to these historic sites, that von Steuben's a big character when you go to Valley Forge today at the national park, and there's a whole monument dedicated to him there now on the battle on not the battlefield but the campsite. So I
And
called it a battlefield.
and and the shots of I did like all of the shots of the cabin, the reconstructed cabins on the site, Washington's headquarters in the snow, all of that kind of stuff. And then in this episode they also cover the Morristown encampment in the harsh winter of 1779 1780. Sorry to Paul Soltis and our friends at Middlebrook, completely ignored that entire
Right.
encampment altogether. But again, that's where they're trying to trying to cover just so much in just such a short amount of time that they're cutting stuff left and right. But yeah, but I do like that they included the Morristown encampment and just how brutal that winter was. That's something I've written about, of talking about how New York froze over, that all the snowstorms they had and everything else like that. It's just amazing kind of what they went through during that time.
Um, so Darren, I'm going to have you give your honest opinion of how they're treating, especially the British commanders who are, military command of all these troops in the colonies or states. Do you think it's a pretty fair interpretation or you think it's very American slanted, or you think it's pretty? I think it's been pretty fair, to be
No,
honest
I
with
think
you.
it's pretty fair, to be honest. I wouldn't say it's one way or the other, to be honest. I think they give everyone that's involved in this war some time, and explain their stories without being biased. I haven't felt that at all with this show. And I think it's the same with the Civil War. When you've got the Confederate Union thing, it's the same sort of thing. It's that same feel, it's quite good.
Right. I mean, because obviously your picture in the background, you're very biased. So I just want to give you an opportunity
Well,
to
yeah,
go.
I'd just like to wind you up. That's all. What I really liked about tonight's program is it started off with a quote from William Pitt Elder, that he says, "You will never take America. You will never conquer it." And the thing is, I was thinking about this before the program started tonight, and I just don't see how Britain ever would have been able to take back once they leave from Boston. They're not ever going to take this continent back ever. They've got too many things going on in the wider scheme of things. And so he makes a valid point of saying that you're not going to conquer it. We've had three campaigns, you can't do anything. And I thought it was a great quote to open with, because that's what I'd been thinking. Again, I'm not super knowledgeable about this at all, like you guys. And I want to go back to what Dan said about, piquing your interest from watching this show. Now I definitely want to know more, it's definitely done that for me. So yeah.
Yeah, I think we've all been saying that the whole week, no matter who comes on. That's the goal of the show, right? Is to draw more people into it. So we will always
Uh,
welcome Darren into Rev War history land. So go ahead, Mark.
I was just gonna pop in and say, because we are talking about bias and we're talking about whether it's biased towards the English or the Americans, I would say I think it's been fairly unbiased in that sense. But tonight it did seem like it was heavily biased against the Americans versus the Indians during that conflict. I think the way they portrayed George Rogers Clark was really bad. And it's not defending what Clark did. I mean, obviously they talk about a lot of the atrocities. One thing and we talked about this with Eric Sterner. I mean, the fighting on the frontier was just like horribly brutal. Really on all sides though. But whereas they showed Sullivan's campaigns against the Native Americans up there, there wasn't much talk about what life was like for settlers on the frontier and some of the massacres and raids. They mentioned briefly Wyoming and Cherry Valley, but they really didn't talk about what those entailed. Whereas for George Rogers Clark, they talk about bringing out Indians and hacking them to pieces in front of the fort. So that kind of set me as like, well, they're not really showing it as, they're really kind of portraying the Native Americans as almost, the victims of this kind of brutal campaign. And in some cases they were, but at the same time they were doing some pretty awful massacres on the other side as well.
Yeah,
I
Gabe,
really
our good friend Gabe mentioned, there's no mention of some of the Oneida and Tuscarora allies. Somebody else on here, I couldn't find in the chat. Someone says it make Clark look like a psychopath.
Yeah,
So,
so
yeah,
so
and
from my sorry.
well, no,
From
I
my
just
point
want
of view, that's what I got, from what Mark was saying there. Sorry, Mark, to cut you off. But I got that sense that he was a psycho from the letter that they read out.
yeah,
You know,
different time.
Well,
no, you're absolutely right, and that was my initial thing as well. And to Gabe's point too, that's also something I haven't gotten from this series is really just how divided the Native Americans were, and they really were. That there are blood feuds and tribes warring against each other going back generations, that kind of like fed into all of the killing that was going on as well. So and their lack of ability to unite against the settlers coming in was part of the reason why a lot of them were dispossessed of their land, because there was an inability of them to find that unification.
Yeah.
But they're kind of portrayed as a monolith. And they'll mention the different tribe names, but they really don't go into how they viewed themselves as distinct peoples separate from each other. That they didn't view themselves all as, oh, we're all Native Americans, so we're all on the same side. That's where they're making individual deals with the British or the Americans or trying to stay out of it. But I really haven't gotten that sense when they've been portraying the Native Americans.
Yeah, and to Mark's point, I really enjoyed the introduction a few nights ago of Dragon Canoe and the Cherokee War. It touched a little bit on the ongoing wars in the Carolinas, French and Indian War up until 1775, beginning of the American Revolution, and also to Mark's point too. I mean, there's going to be Creeks fighting against Anthony Wayne in Georgia in 1780 too. But I think one of the things that was not something very simple is that probably could have been mentioned, going back to a lot of Mark was talking about, is that east of the Appalachian Mountains, there are recognized rules of warfare between the armies. West of the Appalachian Mountains, there are no recognized rules of warfare. It is anything goes. And I think that's a simple point that was sort of, as Mark kind of mentioned, was glossed over in that regard.
So what do you guys think about Arnold? How they treated Benedict Arnold tonight?
Is he going to become a traitor? Yeah. So I mean, they're going to have a lot to cover tomorrow night.
Yeah, right.
They're going to have a lot to cover tomorrow night, because we haven't even gotten. I mean, I really enjoyed how Arnold has been treated up until this point in time, and sort of weaving his story in various instances with Saratoga and Valcour Island, and with the invasion of Canada. And now as sort of governor general, if you will, of
Socialite of
Philadelphia.
Philly, yeah.
But and we kind of touched on how important Washington views West Point. And I thought it was going to get to that was going to be where, okay, Arnold is now going to come back into the picture again. They're going to weave him back into the story, but they didn't. It was sort of a cliffhanger there.
Yeah, I thought that was weird, but it goes
Yeah,
to
sorry.
what they
I
have
think
to
they've done that quite a lot in this series, and I think we all agree that they start telling you a narrative and a story, and then it goes to something else.
Mm.
And it's like they don't actually finish what they were. And again, when I was watching the other day, I had to I thought I'd missed something because I was doing something, and I went back and realised I hadn't, but I thought I had because they didn't explain the story all the way through. So that would be my only criticism.
And Mark, I'm glad you mentioned last night or whatever night it was this week about John Greenwood, and they did bring him back. You talked
They did.
about they put him back home, but then they did talk about him again tonight, which I thought that was a nice touch. They did they kept telling his story about how he just couldn't stay home while his countrymen were fighting.
Yep, and I'm glad they kind of wrapped his story up because they were able to bring in the privateer story, as I was mentioning earlier, which obviously was like a huge draw for a lot of people that were looking to get out of the army, and they tied up nicely by saying he became the dentist for Washington, making his famous dentures, which
Right.
yeah, I thought that was a great story to wrap up. One of the stories I was surprised they didn't include also was Sergeant William Jasper. They talked about Savannah, and I was glad they included
Pulaski.
that. And
Yeah.
Pulaski,
Yes.
who mortally wounded
Yeah.
in the charge there. I mean, I thought they could have gone more in depth about. I mean, because it was almost a Bunker Hill in reverse, where you have almost 800 French and American troops killed and wounded in a short period of time. But yeah, you have the Sergeant William Jasper, and then you have the Pulaski. Yeah, I'm surprised they didn't include that into the story as well. But again, you can only fit so much.
Right. One thing we should have had Eric on tonight because Eric the other night said there was very little Navy. There was a lot of Navy tonight. You got we've talked about that already. Privateers, John Paul Jones was a major focus of this evening, which was good to see. John Adams was brought back a lot about his trip over to France to be one of the diplomats representing the United States. So that was nice to see them. And I know Mark doesn't like the political and social history, Mark. I know you don't like that, but I like the fact that tonight they intertwined it a lot better than I thought they did in the past. Especially with France coming in. I thought they did a really good job talking about once France gets in, how not inconsequential, that's the wrong word, but how small the American colonies were to the British Empire and where they were making their money, right? Making the money in the Caribbean. And this became a sideshow somewhat to them, and they started to pull those troops away from the colonies or the states and put them elsewhere, which played into the story of giving up Philadelphia and then the Monmouth and back to New York. But I thought they did a really good job covering the role and the importance of the French in entering into the war.
Yeah, no, and just the logistical thing of like, all right, now we're allied. What does that actually mean? And then the failed attempt at Newport, the failed attempt at Savannah, and then like so what good is this alliance if it's not nothing is panning out from the support from France because all we're having are these kind of failed things. And I thought Iris DeRoe did a pretty good job of being the talking head, giving that perspective of from the French perspective of what they're thinking too of like how are we supposed to be working with these rebels to try and win this war or whatever.
I got the sense from the British perspective though, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but that King George III is more, upset about losing the Americas than the politicians in London. As they said, you've got a pit of money that they can just spend, spend, and spend, but you know, it's just going to keep getting. But it seems like he's the one that's more concerned and more pushing this as time goes on. Is that something that you guys agree on?
Yeah, I was gonna say that at the very beginning when they had William Pitt's speech in Parliament, talking about if I was an American and there was an army on my shores, I would never, ever, ever let go of my weapons. I thought that was like a really good sense of showing that even in London, there are people that understand what these colonists are willing to do to defend their homes. Because in some senses, yeah, they are Englishmen in some sense.
And
I'm
that,
sure some of them
and that was my point from earlier. If you just was never going to conquer once you lost it. I think maybe you could have maybe taken a state and kept that, but you just not. Once they left that first time, that was it. They lost complete control, and it wouldn't matter anyway. Even if the British had won, say for instance, which wouldn't have happened, but you'd had guerrilla warfare. You would never have been able to control that amount of people. And again, Britain had their fingers in so many pies, they were more worried about other stuff at that point.
Yeah,
And
Well, I was
it,
gonna say they also bring in the whole thing of like it doesn't have to be all or nothing, and it's like, hey, maybe we can get these southern colonies, and we'll cut these
Hmm.
off, and we can do those. And they mentioned that as far as like they're being tactical about and realistic of what they're gonna actually be able to get away with
Like
and
say
stuff.
Georgia, for instance, I got the sense that was quite loyalist sort of territory. So if anything, take that back, sort of thing. But that would have been about it. They wouldn't have been ever to be able to control the rest of the colonies, I don't think, at that point.
and
yeah, and I think that's one of the things through the course of the war, the British High Command, not only in the colonies of the States, but also in London, they don't understand. Even the men who have served there, like the Thomas Gages, the William House, they've only served in a certain portion of the colonies. They don't have a good grasp about how vast just the Atlantic seaboard is
Hmm.
from it north, south, east to west. But I think one of the other things that they also miss, I think Hal he starts to get this a little bit later on. I think spring summer of 1777 is that you have to destroy the Continental Army. You have to destroy Washington. Washington is the heart of the Continental cause. If Washington's army is still in the field, the hope of independence, the cause of independence is still alive. And not to give away obviously too much of the story, but British come close in the South of doing that, of landing some major blows against the Continental armies in the South, but they're just never able. Darren, to your point, they really don't have much of a chance of coming back and really winning the war and winning the colonies back.
And then you add France on top of that with their money and their influence and their navy, as we know. Don't want to spoil the story for later on. That's going to come into play, and it just wouldn't have happened.
I like Mark's favorite congressman was quoted. Did you hear that, Mark? Elbert's Jerry, or Gary, right? We call him Jerry today, but about France, about how, a Protestant nation, I'm butchering the quote, but talking about how this Catholic nation is siding with a Protestant nation, right? And which is something that was very unusual, obviously unheard of 15 years before that happened, but I think it's really neat they tie in that social aspect of religion because it was a big part, right? It was a big part in Canada too with the Quebec Act, but about how, interesting situations make strange bedfellows, right? Like it's like France saw opportunity and the United States at that point didn't care if it was a monarchy or Catholic. It was all about we need the help. And I thought that was a neat quote by Elbert Gary who talked about that.
Yeah, no, and the religious aspect is often overlooked for people who were, very religious and going back, yeah, for centuries. There had been wars fought, largely over religion, and so bringing some of that into the story is really interesting, and you really kind of see where the whole the ideals of religious liberty and stuff are that are going to be important in the formation of the United States government in the future are really kind of taking form during this time period.
I think someone who's coming out of this documentary mentioned throughout, I never expected this, is Lord Dunmore. Lord Dunmore is getting a ton of screen time, which, I'm surprised by. They mentioned him today about, Clinton calling for rebel slaves to join his army once they're in the South, and reading a lot about the Southern campaign. We haven't really gotten into it yet, or campaigns, as my good friends in Camden would say. It's not one campaign; it's many. You don't read a lot about a large number of slaves coming over to the British Army. It did happen, but they do a good job also pointing out that Clinton was no abolitionist, right? I mean, when he captured continental blacks or slaves working for the Continental Army, he sold them into slavery himself. So definitely pointing out that the freedom being offered was a war means, not necessarily trying to create a more equality society.
Yeah, absolutely. I think our friend Carl Borick, who's written on the
Hmm.
siege of Charleston, also emphasizes in his writings that escaped slaves who come into the British lines at Charleston or in South Carolina during the siege or prior to the siege, they're put to work by Clinton on those parallels. They're
Right.
yeah, they're just not hanging around camp getting 3 meals a day. The British are putting them to work.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting that dynamic, and they're going to cover a little bit more of this obviously tomorrow with talking about Cornwallis going through South and North Carolina. But I was just amazed that Lord Dunmore is still hanging around. I'm sure Kate's very excited about that. And some other people that we are good friends with, Andrew Lawler, he wrote a book about Dunmore, who we've had on our podcast. Probably happy to see that Dunmore's getting some coverage. Um, Real quick before
And
we go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to say too, just on that, because they do talk about Clinton and his proclamation, and again how and they're pretty explicit of that it's a war aim. It's not an effort to really end slavery. They talk about they do mention that more run to the British side than join the American side, which I thought was interesting. But then it's kind of like the other, they kind of like bring up some of this stuff, but then they don't really delve into them very deeply. And again, I guess the hope is that it sparks some interest and maybe people will be able to, you know, read more about those things. But it's really just kind of left at that rather than really kind of analyzing, who was going where or why and all those kinds of things, or any like some of the personal stories. But
And I think our good friends up north, looking at you, Brian Mack, who are looking for more Mohawk Valley and other things north. I think tomorrow is going to be 9% south. It almost has to be, I just don't know how you got the whole partisan fight and the violence that goes in there and the partisans in South and North Carolina and Huck's defeat, Waxhaws, all this stuff. Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter. I don't know, Brian. I think we're going to have to spend a little bit more time in the South tomorrow, which I know won't make me very happy. But for those watching, check out Fort Plain. That's a great museum up there in New York. There you
I
go,
was gonna
Brian.
say,
Give your
check
shout
out
out.
Fort. I was gonna say, go to Fort Plain bookstore and
Yeah.
online and get your Emerging Revolutionary War book series, because 2 books we have out about things covered tonight, or actually 3. We got one on Valley Forge by Phil Greenwalt, Handsome Flogging about Battle of Monmouth by Billy Griffith, and To the Last Extremity that covers the whole siege of Charleston by yours truly. But I will say I do like that too when they showed the siege of Charleston, and really focused on that, because, like I said, the siege of Charleston, because it's such a huge defeat, is often overlooked, and a lot of people don't even realize it. Probably a lot of people even live down there in Charleston, so it's really kind of neat. And that's also, I'm glad Dan's on here too, because what the American Battlefield Trust is doing down with the Liberty Trail down in Marion Square and everything else like that, to tell the story at the places where it actually took place is awesome. So
I'm just reading the chat real quick before we wrap up. Gabe makes a good point about how they basically say all the founders were deists, so kind of downplaying the
yeah, I
role of
didn't like
Christianity, which
that.
somewhere obviously we know that, but not all. Another comment here, really quick, about the attention George Rogers Clark got, which I thought was fine. I was, as we said this before we went live tonight, I was surprised by the amount of attention Sullivan got. Like
Yeah.
the Sullivan campaign got a good bit of attention, which, important part of the story. But just interesting how they spent a whole lot of time on Sullivan's campaign going up against the American Indians there. It's just I thought the George Rogers Clark was fine. I just thought the Sullivans was a little bit more than it probably needed to do.
Yeah, they spent a good like 10 or 15 minutes on, which when you only have 2 hours for that one campaign. But I mean, this goes back to, I mean, this whole series, like I said, I mean, it started off really focused on the Native American tribe. So I think that's where they're really trying to bring that aspect into the story, and
And
obviously Sullivan's campaign had a big part of
someone
that.
said it in another one this week where the Civil War documentary kind of not glorified the Civil War, but made it kind of more, romantic. And I think the point of what Burns is trying to do here is make this look like a very violent and bloody war that pitted friends, families, different cultures all on one continent. So I think the Sullivan campaign does that, right? Because it is a pretty violent expedition that takes place out there for both sides. So definitely, I think he's getting across the violence of these several years of this war. Um, One last comment. I'm going to ask you guys to kind of chime in on this. Our good friend Paul Soltis, who Mark has already mentioned, talked about in one of these comments here. Trying to keep up on the comments. There's a lot of comments, so sorry if I can't mention them all. But talked about how Burns is at the beginning makes a point to say this is the most consequential revolution in history. And do you think at this point, and we're almost at the end, you think he's done that? Mark, I'm just gonna go right down the line.
uh, I would say
If you just
no.
watched it, not your own person, if you just from watching the documentary. I know
Yeah,
what you
just
think personally, but just from the show.
yeah, no. I totally agree with the premise. I agree that it is the most significant thing. But I don't think he's been hammering that home at all in this series. I think what this series is really more doing is, uh, making complex the story that we've been traditionally told, and it's hard to do both those things at the same time. And like I said, I kind of keep comparing it to his Thomas Jefferson and even his Ben Franklin documentaries he's done. I mean, like I said, the Thomas Jefferson one, I mean, he hammers it home of like, this is so significant. I mean, the talking heads are saying you cannot understand liberty without understanding Thomas Jefferson. You cannot understand any of this stuff without understanding this man. And I really haven't been getting any of that of like there would be no United States. They did a little bit. There's probably a 5 minute part tonight where they hammered home the significance of George Washington.
Right.
And I think Christopher Brown said like, I don't even agree with the great man theory of history, but
But
this is a great man who without him there would be no United States. I mean, there really hasn't been a lot of that though. There hasn't been a lot of like, and that's where this last episode is going to be so crucial because they're going to have to hammer that home of like this formed our country and this is why it's significant and this is why their sacrifices deserve to be remembered and all of that kind of stuff, which I really hope he is able to do because it is really significant, and they really need to be able to drive that home so that when people end watching this, they're inspired by this story and want to read more about it, rather than just say, oh, this is all complex and it's not as simple as you were told. But there's a driving force behind the whole thing. But up to this point, I would say no, he has not accomplished that. But I'm giving him one more episode to see if he can do it.
Yeah,
Dan.
I think right now it's kind of hard to it's difficult to answer that question. I think they're doing a great job breaking down and telling, as Mark said, a very complex story. I would have to see how they close it out tomorrow night to be able to answer that question. I think it depends on how they finish off the series tomorrow night.
Okay. And Darren, answer that question. And are you the only person in Great Britain that's actually watching this thing?
No, I wouldn't have thought so. But, again, I'm going to, repeat what they sort of said, sort of thing, as you'd have to wait till tomorrow to see if it's got that kind of effect. But I think what it has done for me as a person that's, again, not knowledgeable about this subject, it's made me really, really want to know more, and particularly about the battles, because I know quite a lot about the build up and the end, but I don't really know about that middle part and a lot of those battles. And again, as you said, very violent, horrible, war. And wars are horrible anyway. They're all violent and horrible, but that really emphasizes that in this series. And again, like Mark said, hopefully this is going to inspire somebody to want to learn more, go and visit the battlefields and everything that goes with it. So, and I don't think there is anything like this on the Rev War out there, because I remember asking you, Rob, I said, is there any good documentaries on the Rev War? And you said, well, there's one coming out in November. And so I think, hopefully it has the same effect that the Civil War did. And in 20 years' time, or whatever it is now, 30 years' time, 40 years' time, people are still talking about this documentary as a go-to place to go and learn about it, and then hopefully go on and learn have a deeper dive on it.
That's fair. And yeah, I'm looking, people are giving grades this episode. I think everyone's looking at B and C. So we'll see how tomorrow ends up. I think also, guys, some of Ken Burns's, his baseball documentary is fantastic. His Vietnam one's fantastic. The bar is super high, you know. So it's all when you set the bar so high, sometimes it's hard to meet it. But I'm just glad we got one Brit to watch this. I mean, my job has been accomplished. I'm happy.
And when you think about it, that bar is really high because, again, this is the most important event in American history. This is the founding of the America. That's what you got to think of. So, I mean, how long has it been in production for? 10 years?
A long time.
Yeah.
There you go.
Long time, yeah. So well, all
Here
right,
we
gentlemen.
the rebellious colonies.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, we will wrap up this tonight. I want to thank everyone for watching. Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Dan. And thank you, Darren. Most of all, Darren, you are the most traveled, farthest distance away. And
Thank
I
you.
appreciate you staying up to
I
3
appreciate
a.m.
you guys having me on. Yeah.
To slum it with us Americans over here. And I appreciate the time and all the help you're giving to Emerging Revolutionary War. For those watching, we'll be back on tomorrow night with some more different people to kind of talk about the last episode and probably just do a wrap up of the entire series. I want to appreciate you guys keeping with us all week and watching, and look forward to finishing up tomorrow. Take care. Have a good night.